The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Tim Baker's my name. I'm looking forward to working with you over the next several months. Welcome wherever you are. We've got a huge number of people who have who've registered for this webinar, so that's wonderful news. Probably is a bit of a reflection on the actual topic itself, which is conflict. Special welcome to the Bundaberg Regional Council. I think it looks like we've got a big number of people who are registered from there. That's not probably to suggest that there's much conflict going on there, so hopefully not. So welcome everyone. Look forward to working with you. Now, I want to do a couple of housekeeping things to start the process. Just to let you know that over on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a little arrow with questions next to it. Now, at any stage, if you've got a question that you'd like to ask, or a comment to make, then don't be shy. Just go straight to that question box and type in your question. Jenny has just got things moving by saying, hi, Tim. So hi, Jenny. So that's how you contribute here. We can't unmute everybody. It would just create absolute havoc with all the background noise. So that's the way we communicate. By the way, when you type in your question, I'm the only one that gets to see the question. And of course, I'll attend to it the moment I see it because it comes up on the screen immediately. We just got someone saying they've got some audio problems. Are there anyone else that's got any audio problems? Chandeep's just saying he's got some audio problems. All good here, says Amy. Okay. I don't know what I can do about that, Chandeep. It looks as if it's coming across loud and clear. All good here, says John. Mark says, I can hear you loud and clear. Okay. So look, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. I don't know. All good here, says Mitchell. Thanks, Mitchell. Okay. All fine, says Sam. Megan says, I can hear you too. Great. All good. Okay. All right. I can't help you, Chandeep. I maybe just check your system and just see what's going on there as well. Okay. Trying to get the audio to work. Okay. Good. Keep working at it because I'm sure there's some sort of something there that's not quite right. Okay. All right. Look, let's get underway. Now, look, a couple of housekeeping things. First thing, well, that's the first thing. So if you've got some comment you want to make, a question, that's where you put it. Second thing is that at the end of each session, there's 2 weeks gap between each of these workshops or webinars. And the idea is that you'll be given some homework. Now, when I say homework, I'm talking about practical things. And obviously, if we're dealing with conflict, then it's going to be something around dealing with that. So you go ahead and do that. Chandeep just says his audio is fixed. Brilliant. I'm pleased to hear that. So you'll get some homework to do, and I'll finish up the session on that. The sessions go for an hour. And also don't forget there is an online learning platform that goes with this, and I'll spend a bit of time running through that with you today because once you get in there, it exposes you to a whole lot of things that you can actually look at as well. All right. The other side of it is that if you go to that learning platform, you'll get the slides and the recording. So the whole idea is if you miss a session, you say, oh, well, I just couldn't attend today or whenever. It's not the end of the earth because in that learning platform, you get a copy of the slides and a recording as well, which is wonderful because, you know, the truth is you may not be able to attend all 6 sessions. We'd encourage you to attend the 6 sessions, but if you can't, of course, you've got a backup. All right, well, that's about all I need to say at the beginning. So let's launch into the program and just have a look at what the program's all about. As you can see on your screen there, we've got 6 sessions that we work our way through, and each of those sessions, of course, has a key focal point, and I'll run through and explain that to you as we go. Hi, Carly. Some minor glitches with the sound, says Carly. Yeah, look, not sure how to help there, Carly. Just hang in there. Let me know if you get that things working up and running as they should. All right, so we're going to look at 5 approaches to dealing with conflict. Now, one of the bits of homework I want to give you is that there is a conflict diagnostic to complete in the learning platform. I'd like you to complete it. Some of you, I dare say, will have completed it already. That would be very useful because it'll help you understand your preferred style of dealing with conflict. Next time we meet, we're going to talk about understanding people and their personalities, and that's always useful when we're talking about conflict, and I'm going to address it from the point of view of conflict. We're going to talk about managing emotions in conflict situations because often that's the big hurdle, that we feel so stressed about opening up a can of worms, we don't bother going there. So let's talk about managing that a little bit more effectively. Ultimately, if you said to me, what is the key skill that a person who is good at dealing with conflict has, and there's probably being assertive. Now, assertive doesn't mean aggressive, and I'll explain the difference between assertive and aggressive when we get to Unit 4 and the difference between the two. In Unit 5, we'll look at some of the essential skills for conflict resolution and some of the key things that you need to keep in mind when you're dealing with that. And the final workshop, we'll look at giving and receiving constructive feedback or constructive criticism or feedback, and that might be receiving it or giving it. And sometimes people have some issues around that, and so I wanted to address that as a separate topic. So that's the program, folks. Now, what I want to do now is just introduce you to the learning platform and just show you actually live how you get into the system, what's in the system, and all the rest of it. So bear with me. I'm just going to minimize this screen, and I'm going to go to this screen, as you can see. So what you do is your username. So this is how you get into the system. I sent you a link. So you click on the link. The link will take you to this site. You click on, you put in your username, which is basically your email address, the one that you're registered for. You'll be aware, should be aware that the password is welcome20. No gap between welcome and 20. So once you've got that in, you click on sign in and it'll take you into the site. Now, obviously I've got lots of programs I'm running, so this won't be like your site, because what'll happen is you'll just have one little tab up here, which is essentially this one, which is dealing with conflict. So if we click on there, I've decided that I'm going to go into there and have a look at the program. Let me show you what's in there. So when you get to this screen, what you do is up here, you've got the title, and if you click on the little tab here, what it'll do, and it's just a delayed reaction on your screen, it'll come up very shortly. What it'll do, it'll take you to this screen, which you can see they've got the title here, and you've got 6 different modules, right? Now, each of these modules coincides with the webinars. So that's a good overview, and you can just go straight into the module that you need to. Now, I'm going to go into this one, which of course is idea or part number 1, which is obviously today's session. Let's open it up and have a look at what's in there. There's a bit of a blurb about what the topic's about. If I scroll down, you will see I've already uploaded a copy of the slides for you. So the slides are already there. So you'll notice that there's no recording yet because it's happening now and it'll be uploaded. Now, what I want you to concentrate on is, you notice down here it says conflict resolution profile. Now, this is the homework basically. So if I click on that link, you'll see it open up shortly, take us to a Word document, and you can then, of course, you can print it out and complete it that way. Now, that's your homework. Now, there's a whole lot of other things that are accessible inside the learning platform. So I encourage you to use it. It's part of the fee that's been paid, and it gives you a chance to, you can do some journaling in there. You can try some quizzes. You can watch a video. There's a whole bunch of things. So I'd strongly recommend, to get the best out of this particular Lunch and Learn series, is you go into that whole process there. All right, so I'll just click out of that for the time being, and then this arrow down the bottom, it'll take you to the next section. All right, and there's a lot of learning material in there for you. So it's just a question of picking out the bits and pieces that you would like to touch on. All right, so that's that. Let me know if there's some issues getting into the site, but I think it should be pretty right as long as you follow the directions that I've sent you. Okay, so you will get an email from me this afternoon, which will have the links for the other 5 webinars. It will also have a link for you to get into the learning platform. So keep your eyes out for that. And if you're wondering, it's Lunch and Learn. I always start it with Lunch and Learn series, and then I'll have some information at the end of that. All right, so let's get back to my slides and we'll continue the program. So get the best out of the program, go in and have a look and see what's available for you there. Now, what I want to cover in this session today is 3 topics. I want to talk about the 5 approaches of dealing with conflict. I want to talk about when you can use them, and I'm going to share with you some case studies, and I'm actually going to get you to participate online and actually indicate how you'd resolve these case studies, which of the 5 approaches you use. So look, conflict's something we can't avoid, basically. 2 people on a desert island, there's going to be conflict at some point. So it's one of those things that we've just got to learn to be reasonably good at. And it's not all about skills, although obviously some of it is about skills. It's also a lot to do with mindset. So it's how you think about the whole nature of conflict. So, for example, if you think that conflict is an unpleasant experience, always, sometimes it is, of course. If you always think it's an unpleasant experience, well, you know what? It's likely that you're probably going to avoid it because of the unpleasantness of it. So a lot of it's got to do with the way you think about these things, not just the skills that you bring to bear when you're placed in a difficult situation. We've got to deal with other people. All right, so let's get underway. Now you can see what I'm going to put up now is on the screen is this model, and this model comes from Thomas Kilmann. Thomas Kilmann put together this conflict resolution model many years ago, and there's a copy of this, of course, in your learning platform, but I'm going to talk about this pretty much for most of this time we are together here initially. You'll notice that these model at the bottom, we've got cooperativeness. That's the horizontal axis, and then we've got a vertical axis that talks about assertion. So the 2 key things in dealing with conflict are the degree of cooperation or cooperativeness and the degree of assertion. And you'll notice that in the green space, there are 5 different approaches to dealing with conflict. So when you complete your homework, which is that profile I showed you, it will indicate to you which of these 5 is your preferred style of dealing with conflict. Now, that's useful to know because your preferred style will probably dictate you using that style more than you probably should. So, for example, if you've got a preferred style of dealing with conflict that's competing, that is a win-lose, you win, they lose, if that's your preferred style, then that's how you're probably going to approach most conflict situations in the workplace because you feel comfortable doing that. And the problem with that, of course, is that you are not exercising a range of different approaches that you can use. So the very first thing we want to do in the Lunch and Learn series is understand your preferred conflict resolution style. So that's why the homework is there for you. So what I'm going to do during our session today is debrief you on this particular model, talk about it. And so when you do the profile, it'll make a lot of sense to you. And you can say, oh, okay, I remember Tim talking about X or Y the other day. All right, so let's talk about this model. Now, if you look at, let's look at competing to start with. Now, competing is essentially a win-lose situation. So when you compete about something, ultimately you win and the other person loses, assuming, of course, you're successful. So it's high on assertion because obviously you've got to hold your ground in order to compete, but it's low on cooperativeness because ultimately the other person probably doesn't want to lose. So therefore, they're not going to be all that happy about losing in that situation with you. But of course, there's a time and a place to use this, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I just want you to familiarize yourself with these 5 terms. So let's cast our eyes down to the bottom right-hand corner and look at accommodating. So accommodating is a situation of lose-win. It's the opposite to competing. So this is where you lose and the other person wins. Now you might say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, there are circumstances where sometimes it's best to lose. So it's the old adage of you can win, you let them win the battle so you can win the war. And I'll talk more about that later. So they're the 2 extremes. And then if you look at this one over here, which is avoiding, which is low on assertion and low on cooperativeness, and you might think, well, goodness me, I can't imagine that avoiding is a good thing in conflict. Well, in fact, it can be very useful in certain circumstances, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So avoiding is a legitimate strategy for dealing with conflict. The trouble is, of course, if you're used to avoiding conflict, then it's likely that you're avoiding things that you perhaps shouldn't be avoiding and you should be dealing with them. So not everything needs to be avoided. Now, up here you've got the 2 compromising. You might say, why is compromising halfway down the assertion and halfway down the cooperative ladder? Well, when you compromise with someone, what you ultimately do is you make concessions. So you give something in exchange for something else in order to resolve the conflict. And the classic example of that, of course, is purchasing a house. When you purchase a property, normally the buyer has a price in mind and the seller has another price in mind, and normally they're not always the same. And so what happens is that you usually meet halfway between the 2 in order to get the successful purchase. That's a compromise. So real estate is based on the whole notion of compromising. In fact, the culture that we work in here in Australia is very much prone towards compromise. So there's lots of things in the workplace that we consider to be appropriate. It is appropriate to compromise. But again, not everything is open to compromise. And then the last one there is collaboration, which is in the top right-hand corner. Now, when you collaborate with someone, what you'll notice it's high on assertion and high on cooperativeness. So you could probably think to yourself, well, surely that would be the best approach. Well, it is if you've got the time. When you collaborate with someone, you've actually got to spend time with them, working your way through the issues in order to get to a resolution. And of course, in our busy lives, we don't often have the opportunity or the time to do that. And that becomes problematic. So therefore, often we've got to revert to one of the other 4 because we don't have time to collaborate. But ultimately, collaborate is problem solving where both parties get what they want. It's just that it's done in a problem solving manner, whereas compromising is that both parties get part of what they want, but not everything. So those are the 5 approaches. And you might say, well, which is better? And I would say to you that it depends on 3 things. Ultimately, when you're dealing with conflict, there are 3 key characteristics. There's your profile, and remember, all of us have a preferred style here. The question for you is to find out what that is by completing the profile in the learning platform. The second variable is that the other person has a profile as well, assuming, of course, it's a one-on-one. So therefore, maybe they haven't completed the conflict resolution profile, but they've certainly got a preferred way of dealing with conflict. So there's those two variables to start with, and then there's a third variable, which is the situation that you're being put in. So all three of those come into play to determine which might be the better way of dealing with the conflict. Now, none of us are smart enough to sort of sit there and say, okay, now what's the situation? What is this profile? Usually conflict just happens. So here's the key point. The key point is that if plan A doesn't work, we don't keep banging on about plan A. We try a plan B or a C or a D or an E. So what we need to be doing is, in order to become effective in conflict, we need to be versatile enough to be able to embrace all of these 5 approaches depending on the circumstances. Let me give you a classic example. I know not all of you are managers, but let's assume that you are a manager. Let's assume that 2 of your team members are having an altercation. Now, it's a mild altercation and you don't think there's anything to it, so you don't bother to get involved. All right, so you decide to avoid it initially. In other words, you're not going to get involved, so that's avoiding because you think they're 2 grown-up adults, they should be able to sort their own issues out. After a short period of time, the voices are starting to rise. People are getting heated, they're getting upset, and it ultimately means that you can no longer avoid it. So you decide now to grab both of those people, bring them into a private area, and what you're going to try and do is try and sort out the problem with both of them. You're looking for some sort of a compromise. Now, both of those people have got their eyes crossed and their arms crossed, and there's just no way in the world that they want to give an inch to the other person. So compromising isn't going to work. So I've now tried to avoid, I've now tried to compromise. So I might then look at both and say, look, are you both willing to work with me to resolve this so that you're both happy, or we can resolve this? So what I'm trying to do now is to collaborate. So I'm now going to move to collaborate. You notice that's a straight line that I'm going on the model. I'm now going to try and collaborate. And after a while, I find that that's futile. I'm not getting anywhere. So I've now tried 3 approaches and I've got nowhere. So then I might say to them, I might pull rank and say, look, I'm the supervisor here, or I'm the manager. This is what's going to happen. And then I'm going to compete. So basically in the same situation, I can use 4 different approaches, but that's no guarantee it's going to work, but it's far more likely to work if you're open to the possibility of trying a number of approaches in dealing with conflict rather than just sticking to your preferred style. That's my point. So the key message out of today is find out, 1, what your profile preferences are, and 2, be prepared to use all 5 depending on the circumstances that you might be in. All right, so let's look a little deeper at this. Let's look at the first one, which I discussed earlier, which is competing. Now, competing is win-lose. I win, you lose. Let's look at when you could use that. A couple of different approaches and times you could use that. If you have to make a decision and speed is critical, so in other words, it's got to be a quick decision, you just don't have the luxury of time, it may well be that you just make the decision. You just make the decision unilaterally without consulting anybody because, frankly, you don't have the time to do that. Now, in an emergency, for example, that would be the perfect time to do that because obviously you don't have the time to talk to other people. Now, that would be a fair and reasonable thing to do and a justification for doing that. But of course, you wouldn't want to be using that as an excuse all the time. Another reason that you might use that is that someone's trying to take advantage of your goodwill. So, you're a very cooperative person, you're trying to do all the right things, and you're finding that someone's steamroller, is driving a steamroller over the top of you, and you've had enough, and you need to stand your ground on principle. Well, that would be a perfect reason to do that if somebody's taking advantage of your goodwill. Another reason that you might use this is if, for example, have to make unpopular decisions. So, for example, it's a decision that basically other people are not going to like. You know that before you make the decision. So in those circumstances, trying to consult with other people is not a good idea because ultimately they're not going to like it anyway. So you just make the decision and you let people know that you've made the decision. You perhaps empathise with them that they're not going to like it, but ultimately that's the decision that has to be made. So that would be a time when you might compete. I see a lot of people, they engage people in conversation. All the while they have to make this decision. So just make the decision. It's the only way to go. You'll find that people will at least respect you for being straight with them about that. So let's go to accommodating. Now, accommodating, as I mentioned, is opposite. You can see it's down in the bottom right-hand corner. When would you use that? This is, remember, where you lose and they win. So you might think, when would I use that? Well, there are a lot of opportunities to use that. One of those opportunities is that the relationship that you have with the other person, if it's in the workplace, it's a working relationship, and those of us that are in any form of relationships would understand the need to accommodate, because there won't be a relationship if you don't. That's the reality of it. We have to learn to accommodate. But in the workplace, if you have to work with that person on a regular basis, it may well be that you know that by digging your heels in, it's actually going to impact negatively on the relationship. It might well be that you actually let them win the battle. So, you know, at the end of the day, if there's a big price to pay, which is bigger than winning this particular battle, then it's probably better just to let go. Of course, if you've got no hopes of getting your needs met, then clearly what are you doing getting involved in that? We get involved in too many bun fights around the place. Sometimes it's not worth it. Just let it go. Let it go. If it's not important to you, let it go. And of course, if you're not going to win, let it go. I mean, for example, if you're having an argument with your boss and your boss, you've got a view one way and they've got a view another way, and there's no way in the world you're going to win, and frankly the boss is the boss, ultimately it might just be best to think, well, I best keep the peace here and I'll let them win because they're a bigger fish to fry. Another reason you'd use that, and probably the most important reason, is that it's not important. In fact, to you, in the scheme of things, it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. So why would I even engage myself in that? So I just let it go. Now, if you've got a high score on accommodating when you complete your profile, you may be deluding yourself occasionally to think that it's not important to you when it really probably is important to you. So make sure that you think about that before you jump in. Now, you might think avoiding, when would avoiding be a good time or good opportunity to deal with conflict? Well, there are lots of opportunities. One of those would be where diplomacy is, but let's assume that you're in a meeting with another person. Let's assume that there are several people at the table. Let's assume that one of the people in the meeting says something that's actually incorrect. But you think to yourself, if I actually correct them at this point, it will take us off on a tangent. I don't want to go. I actually need people to be on board with this. And so you decide not to correct that person because you don't want them to lose face in front of everybody else. And quite apart from that, it's going to destroy the objective of the meeting in the first place. It's probably better to say nothing. Many of you in this are in local government, and I would imagine dealing with ratepayers. A ratepayer says something that's perhaps a little bit incorrect, but it's not really going to impact on the conversation that you're having with them at the time. Correcting them just for the sake of correcting them may not necessarily be the best course of action at the time. That doesn't mean you're being dishonest about it. It just means that I don't want to go there. Another case might be that if somebody's a bit hot under the collar, and we all get that way at times, then it might just be best to find another time to deal with it. In other words, if someone's upset about something, they're not going to be thinking too rationally about things, and quite frankly, you're best to probably find a better time to talk about that because of the way they're feeling at the time. Now, of course, this is an excuse not to deal with it. You're still going to come back to it at another point, but you might put it off till a time when it's a better time to deal with it. Another time when you would avoid is that neither the relationship or the issue is important to you. Now, the fact is you can't get involved in every bun fight around the place, and nor should you. And those of you that feel the need to do that, you're really probably just creating a problem for yourself. Just let it go. I mean, there are too many things to get involved in. You just physically can't do it. Obviously, if it's important, you do. But if it's not important, just let it go. There's no need to get involved in something that frankly is trivial in the big scheme of things. Life's too short. And of course, one of the very best reasons to avoid is if you need to find out more. So, for example, if somebody bails you up in the corridor, or they're out at the depot, or they're somewhere and they bail you up and you really don't have the answer for them because you're not prepared. And in fact, you don't have all the information you need to give them an answer, then it's probably better for you to say to them at that point, look, leave it with me. I'll do some investigation and I'll come back to you at another time. That would be probably a better way of dealing with it. Unfortunately, we don't do this very often. I don't think we do it often because we think we've got to have an answer for somebody, even when we're put on the spot. And that's not necessarily the case. You don't need to address something right there, right then. So you're better off to say, leave it with me, give me some time, I'll sort it out. And it's not a fob off. You're actually going to come back to them at the appropriate time. So you can see there are a lot of good opportunities to avoid. But of course, if you've got a high score on avoiding in your profile, then it probably suggests that you're avoiding things that you perhaps shouldn't be avoiding. But of course, if you've got a low score on your profile, it's probably suggesting that you probably should be avoiding things that you're not. So that's why the profile can be very useful to give you some sense of where that's at. So let's look at collaboration. As I said before, it's a great style if you've got time. And of course, you need to have a conversation or two or three with somebody in order to collaborate. So when you're collaborating with somebody, usually it's a good idea to collaborate is when the relationship's important and the issue's important. So you've got to work with this person on an ongoing basis. And frankly, you've got to resolve the issue. Well, then obviously that's a situation where you're going to have to talk to the other person, and collaboration's important. So you would sit down and you would work your way through that to come to a resolution that both you and they are happy with. So you can't collaborate with someone that's not motivated to have an outcome. So clearly it's important to make sure that the other person's motivated to collaborate, because not everybody is. Some of the best things you can do, one of the best things you can say to someone is, are you willing to work with me to see if we can resolve this so we're both happy, is a great question. Because if they and ah about that, then there's no point in going into collaboration, because frankly, they're not ready for it. So testing the water is a good thing to do. So when all parties need to be committed to a solution, so where, inside your organisation, you're working with someone else who has a equal commitment to resolving the issue as you do, then that's a perfect opportunity for you to collaborate, because they're just as motivated as you to resolve it. So therefore, that would be a case where you could collaborate. And of course, sometimes when you do collaborate with people, you ultimately come up with an even better result than you would be if you tried the other four approaches, because it requires you to brainstorm and work through a number of situations, and that's why it can be very effective. But of course, as I said, the big downfall of this approach is that you need the time to do it. And if you haven't got the time, then you have to obviously use one of the other four approaches. Compromise. Now, compromise is, you might say, what's the difference between collaboration and compromise? Well, collaboration is win-win. So ultimately, you're coming up with a solution that both parties are happy with. Whereas compromise is you're coming up with a solution where both parties are making concessions. Now, one of the key learning points out of this is if you're trying to compromise with someone and you're not, you're not getting anywhere, then it's a good idea to say to the other person, are you willing to work with me to see if we can come up with some, a solution that we're both happy with? In other words, move them from compromise to collaboration. Or equally, if you're in collaboration and you're trying to sort of brainstorm and ideas and time's running out, then it might be a time for you to say, well, look, we're just going to have to make some concessions here because we're running out of time and we're just going to make a decision. I'm willing to do this if you're willing to do that. So, as I said, time running out would be a good time to use that. Sometimes it can be used when collaboration or competing fails, so you've got that opportunity as well. It can be a temporary solution, so you could say to the other person, look, in the short term, I'm willing to do this if you're willing to do that. And then after this, how about we come back and sit down and try and work out a solution that we're both happy with? So that can be very, very effective in that sense. Sometimes compromise is the only way, and certainly, as I said before, it's a cultural imperative. In many cases in this culture, compromise is a very acceptable way of doing business. And so people kind of have an expectation that compromising is probably the ideal way to go about dealing with things. Now, I'm going to share with you a busy slide, but I don't want to go through it in great detail, but I just wanted to make the point that, and of course, as you know, you've already got a copy of these slides in your pack, but ultimately, every one of those 5 conflict resolution approaches has advantages and disadvantages. Now, I'm not going to run through them all laboriously. You can read them for yourself, but what I guess I'm alluding to is that there's no one style that's better than the others. The point is for you and I to become more effective at dealing with conflict, we need to be adept at using all 5 styles in the right circumstances with the right people. So the profile is a good starting point, and then you can get to a stage where you can be a little bit more flexible in terms of the things that you'd like to try in the workplace. You'll notice down the bottom left-hand corner it says evading. It's the same thing as avoiding. It's just another word for that. But ultimately, everything that's on the screen talks about the pros and cons of each approach. And of course, the key for you and me is if Plan A doesn't work, we don't just keep banging on with Plan A. We move to a Plan B or a Plan C. So what that means is to become effective at dealing with conflict, that you're approaching it from a different angle and not just one angle. That's really an important point. Now, that's not to suggest that the other person may not be wanting to change, but ultimately, if you don't change, then nothing changes. And if you're banging your head against a brick wall, after a while, it gets a little sore. And so you've got to try something else. And not every conflict situation that you're in has to be a win for you, as I said earlier, and I think you probably got that point as well. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 5 different scenarios or 5 different situations. So what I want you to do is type in the question box. So you can open up your question box in a minute. And I want you to, after I've read through this situation, to type in how you would resolve this. Now, there's limited information, of course, but I want you to indicate, would you avoid it? Would you accommodate? Would you compromise? Would you compete? Or would you collaborate, put in that position? So let me read the first one out to you. So a customer calls and wants you to handle an order for him. You no longer work in that team, and it would create a major problem internally if you cross departments. However, the customer who orders a moderate amount of product has been very insistent with you. All right, so you've got this relationship with this person. They're coming to you because they feel comfortable. They've dealt with you in the past. And look, if you're in local government, this could be around amalgamation and where things have changed. And I'm sure you were exposed to these sorts of things in the past, and you've got a ratepayer coming to you. So what do? Do you this happens to you and you're put in this position, do you compete? Do you avoid? Do you accommodate? Do you compromise? Or do you collaborate? So in the question box, I'd like you to type in, what would you do? Which of those would you do? Would you compete, avoid, collaborate, compromise? Let's have a look and see what people are saying. All right, so here we go. And we've got lots of people here. So let me see where we start. Wow, we've got a lot of people here. All right, so Robin says compromise. Sam says compromise. Jenny says accommodate. Customer satisfaction is important. I'll come back to that, Jenny. Jethro says collaborate. Mitchell says compete. Nick says compromise. Chris says collaborate. Carl says compromise. Leona says accommodate. Francis says compromise. Kerry says avoid. Edward says collaborate. Sandra says compromise. Margaret says compromise. Michelle says compromise. Janine says collaborate. Amy says compete. Decision person won't like. Yep. Megan says compromise. Helen says compromise. Chandeep says compromise. Okay, and there are some others coming in as well. Look, let's have a look at what you wouldn't do. Okay, let's have a look at what you wouldn't do. That's a good place to start. Let's actually have a look. Now, this is me. I can't avoid it, although I noticed that one of you said that's a good idea. I can't avoid it because ultimately they're there, and I'm put in this position of, I mean, I might avoid it to create some space for myself. I can understand that. But ultimately I can't avoid the situation because that person's there, either on the phone or face to face. So I can't do that really, unless I'm, buying myself time. Competing's probably not a wonderful idea because ultimately if I compete with the other person who clearly is a good customer, it might be, if there was competition, at least, who might go across the road and go to my competitors. So I'm not sure that that's a good idea. Of course, it depends on how you set it, of course. Now, what's the problem with accommodate? Now, if I accommodate with that person, in other words, I take the order and I deal with it, I'm going to have some strife internally. So I'm going to create a conflict by accommodating. I'm going to please the customer, no question, but I'm going to create a conflict internally. And what I may also do is train that person to come back to me next time. So I've done nothing really to resolving the long-term problem. So it leaves us with compromise and collaboration. It's possible that what I might do is I might say, look, let me introduce you to Fred or Mary. They're now doing that job. I no longer do that job, or I'm no longer involved in that area. And what I will do, though, is I'll make an introduction for you. And then ultimately, once that introduction's been made, you'll know where you can go. So that could be a collaboration. All right. And look, a compromise might be that I decide to deal with it then, and then I'm going to make the introduction later, the next time round. So there's a couple of ways of dealing with it, but you can see from the comments and the question and the responses we had, we get lots of different approaches to how we might deal with it. And obviously, if we had more information, we may change our mind. Let's have a look at the second one. So that's great, guys. Just again, I want you to answer the question, how would you deal with it? Let's look at number 2. Okay, here it is. I'll read it through. This is a personal one. I've had this happen to me. You may have had it happen to you too. It's not very pleasant. You've had your car in for a repair, okay? And although they claim it's fixed, you have got the same problem. It's not a regular fault and it's obvious, okay? You paid your bill when you collected the car and you're not prepared to pay any more. They are the only dealer that is at all convenient for you. You want your car fixed now. What do? Do you compete? Do you avoid? Do you accommodate? Do you compromise? Or do you collaborate, put in that circumstance that I've just described? Let's have a look and see what people are saying. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, let's have a look. All right, so we've got Kerry says compete. Megan says collaborate. Jenny says collaborate. Oh, we've got them all coming in now. Sam says collaborate. Mitchell says collaborate. Janine says collaborate. Compete. Francis. Yeah, really, we've got hundreds coming in by the look of it. Nick says wouldn't have paid the bill. Yeah, okay, yeah, you were caught out, Nick, and so ultimately, Nick, what you're saying is that then you would compete under those circumstances. I think Helen's agreeing with you in competing, and so is Edward, and so is Jethro. Okay, let's have a look at what you wouldn't do. Thanks, guys. I probably didn't read out everybody's answer, but you ultimately, whoop, I went too far there. Let me go back. Problem 2, there we go. Now, if we look at this, you can't avoid it, can you? Because obviously you need your car. So that basically is not going to work. You shouldn't accommodate, because ultimately, if you accommodate, you're conceding that they're right and you're wrong. Ultimately, you may be paying more money. And you may, pardon the pun, be taken for a ride. You can't do that. Compromise and collaboration are possible. Collaboration, definitely. But I think what I would do in these circumstances, and I think the majority of you would agree with me, is I'd probably compete initially because I paid my bill. And because I paid my bill and the problem's fairly obvious and it's not fixed, I think I'd be on fairly safe ground to do that. Now, when I say compete, that doesn't mean I'm going to jump up and down and scream and shout. That's not what I mean. I'd ultimately have to deal with it. So I deal with it accordingly, but I do it I do it in an appropriate way. I just firm, basically, what I mean by that. So I can see that. Now, if that doesn't work, then obviously I'm going to find a new dealership, even though it's inconvenient for me. But I think the point is that I might start collaborating. But I think what I would do initially is compete, and I think that would be my first port of call. And I don't know, I'm not sure everyone would agree with that, but I think the majority of you would probably see that as a reasonable way. Let's look at number 3. Now, this is, I'll read this out again, and again, I'd like you to select which of the 5 you would use. You're a manager of a team that currently has a manual recording system, and your analysis shows greater productivity if it's automated. Susan Jones runs the same kind of operation in another team. She disagrees with your proposition, citing customer concerns and employee resistance, plus technical problems with the system you're proposing. Your manager has told you that to resolve the situation with Susan because you both must run the same way. All right, so your manager's saying fix it. You've got a view of the world. Susan's got a view of the world. You're both on equal footing. How do you resolve it? Let's see what people have come up with. Let's see what we end up with as such. All right. Okay, how do we resolve it? So if we look at it, Kerry's saying collaborate. Nick's saying collaborate via logical reasoning. Yeah, okay, with stats and so on, Nick, so you can prove your point. Jenny's saying competing, best of interests of the organisation. Yeah, good, I understand that. So Jenny, you're basically saying that your idea may well be best, and if it is the best, then you have a right to put it to the test. I think that's a fair suggestion. Carl says collaborate, so does Margaret, so does Kerry. Chandeep says collaborate. Leona says collaborate because of technical issues. Yeah, because you've taken that into consideration. LZ says collaborating with fair discussion from both sides. Megan says maybe compromise after that. Yeah, Gary says compete then collaborate. All right, guys, that's very good. Let's have a look at what you can't do. Righto, so you can't avoid it because the boss is saying fix it, so that's out. So that's not going to work. You can, I think there's grounds to compete if you are, to get your point across that you believe that this is the best way forward, but then you've got to also give Susan the opportunity to do the same. I think the answer is probably you can't really compromise on this one, although some of you have selected that, because your boss is saying it's got to run the same way. So it can't be automated or manual. It's got to be one or the other. So you're in a position where you've got to select one of two ways. So collaboration is probably a better model for this. And because you're on equal terms and you're both motivated to resolve it, I think you could probably work with Susan to come up with a suggestion. So it might be that you might say, well, let's run it my way for the first week, and then Susan, your turn next week, and then let's get our teams together and we'll sort out which is the best way forward. So that would be sort of a way forward to collaborate. Yeah, I think this is probably a classic collaboration one ultimately, and your boss is wanting you to fix it. So there's motivation to get it done. There's a relationship to maintain, and I think that's probably the way forward. Let's have a look at number 4. Okay. Now, this is a really interesting one because it happens more than we probably would like to think it does, but let me read it through. Your boss has a personal dislike for one of your team and is insisting that you not renew their contract. All right, so they've said that to you. Whilst you recognise some occasional problems, you can manage that quite easily, and that person is in fact important to your team output. So what do? You put in that difficult position. How do you deal with that? Let's have a look and see what people have come up with. Okay, they're rolling in. So Jenny says collaboration. Chris says compete. Francis says compete. Francis, okay, they're all coming in now. Accommodate. Boss is the boss, says Edward. I'll come back to that, Edward. That could create a problem for you, and I'll explain that in a minute. Leona says collaborate. Sam says compete. There's a lot of different points of view here. It's very interesting. Let me talk about it for a minute. Now, you've got a situation. Whoop. My slides are a little bit sensitive today. There we go. We're back where we need to be. I'll keep my hands free. It is possible to avoid this, you know. I don't mean... Now, let me explain what I mean by that. You're in the car with your boss and you're going from A to B, and you think the boss is just out of sorts in a bad way, and you decide not to do anything about it because you're not sure that he or she is serious. Sandra says compromise. So you're not sure that he's serious or she, and if they bring it up again, obviously you can't avoid it any longer because clearly, they've mentioned it twice. So I am just pointing out it is possible to avoid initially. Now, I can see why people have said competing, because I think at the end of the day, you probably should point out to the boss that this person's actually got reasonable technical skills, even though they're a pain in the backside. So clearly they're, so ultimately you might compete on the basis that it is a personal issue, not a work-related issue, because clearly it says that you can deal with the situation that you've got. So I can certainly see that as a possibility. Now, one of the things I wouldn't do, and Edward, you mentioned, the boss is the boss. if you accommodate, what's going to happen? Well, your boss is going to get their way. But what's also going to happen is that probably the rest of your team are going to think, heavens above, if that's how, if that's the extent to which you stand up for whoever, what do you do when my back's turned? So you're going to have a price to pay with trust in your team. So that's going to be problematic for you. So I'm not convinced that that's the right way. Obviously, if that person had performance issues, I get that. But remember, this is a personal dislike. It's not a question of performance, and that's where it becomes interesting. Kerry says, stand up for members of the team, especially when they are valuable team members. Yeah. Look, that's essentially what I'm getting at, Kerry. So that's probably not the best way forward. Now, of course, if your boss is insistent about it, then I'd probably be sort of wondering about your working relationship with them as well, because obviously that doesn't sound like it's going to work very well, and there's going to be some sort of long-term consequences there. Compromise. Out of sight, out of mind. Maybe I can move them to another shift. Maybe I can sort of, do something in that regard. Collaboration. I might sit down with the boss and sort of talk this through and point out that I'm actually quite happy, and I can give some statistical evidence that that person's actually performing up to scratch, and that really what we're talking about is a personal issue. All right, let's look at number 5. Now, number 5, I want you to tell me how you'd respond to this. You're a manager. You want to design a new system in a way that suits you. All right, so that's your thinking. Your approach at the managers' meeting is to raise it with the other managers who are all affected by the proposed new system. So you're going to put it on the table, you're going to talk it through, and so forth. One of the other managers around the table says it's too costly that way, and that each manager should simply offer their approach and the GM make the decision. In other words, bump it upstairs. The question is, how do you respond to that suggestion? So someone around the table said, oh, look, let's just bump it upstairs and the boss can make their own choice. Now, bear in mind, of course, that you want the system to work that suits you in a certain way. So there's a bit of self-interest in going on there. So let's have a look at what you would do. Okay, let's have a look and see how you deal with it. Jenny says to collaborate. Yeah, I think I get that, Jenny. Nick says accommodate sounds fair. So if I bump it upstairs, what is the boss going to think? I certainly wouldn't be very impressed. I'd be saying to you guys, have you sorted it out? You sort it out first. If you can't sort it out, then send it to me, but I want you to at least have a crack at it. And I don't think you've given it enough opportunity. Kerry said I'd compete with that. Helen says I'd collaborate. Janine says collaborate to find something they all agree on. Okay, good, I get that. Compete, nothing to lose, says Edward. Okay, you can have a go. Yeah, why not? Leona says I'd collaborate. Look, let's look at what you wouldn't do. I'm not sure that accommodate would be the right way to go, because ultimately, remember, there's some self-interest here. You want to resolve it in a way that suits you. So I think you would at least want to have some influence over that decision and not just bump it upstairs. So I'm not sure that's a good idea. Francis says compete, stand up for the system's virtues, and then perhaps either collaborate or compromise. Good answer, Francis. Look, I think that it would be probably reasonable for you in those circumstances. Now, can you compete? Well, I guess you could actually say, well, look, let me explain why I think we need to go down this road. And I think that would be a sort of a competing way. And maybe people would listen to you, maybe they wouldn't. But I think ultimately the way forward here is to perhaps compromise or collaborate. So basically you could probably say, look, why don't we spend the next half an hour discussing our solution, And if we can't come up with a resolution, we'll bump it upstairs. But let's at least give it a try to see if we can come up with something, because ultimately we're the ones that have to deal with it. So you see, what I'm doing there is a kind of a collaboration / compromise. And if the time runs out and we've got nowhere, sure, we can then send it on to the GM and then they can sort it out. So that might be the way forward, perhaps. Okay, we're just about out of time, and I just wanted to let you know that the key message out of all of this is simple, and that is we need to be flexible, right? We need to be flexible, and I think that point's been made by looking at some of those scenarios. Don't overuse your preferred style, and of course you'll find out what that is when you go into your learning platform. And if plan A doesn't work, then try plan B, C, D, and all the rest of it. So homework, this is what I want you to do. I mentioned it earlier. Complete the diagnostic in the learning platform. You'll get an email from me this afternoon and it'll sort of explain how to get in there. If you haven't signed up to the other webinars, do so at the same time, because otherwise you won't be getting the automated emails and reminders and all the rest of it. Even if you can't attend, sign up anyway, and then be prepared to do the profile online. So folks, that's it from me. Next time we meet, we're going to look at understanding people and their personalities, and there's another profile there for you to complete at that stage too. So I'm done. So I'm ready to sign out. Thanks, Janine. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Leona. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Jethro. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Carly. Thanks, Patrick. Oh, they're all coming in now. Thanks, Tim. Really great way to undertake the learning in small sessions. Thanks, Francis. Lovely comment. Thanks. Cheers, Tim. See you in a fortnight, says Carl. Excellent, says Kerry. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Timbo. All good. Thank you, everyone. We'll catch up in a fortnight. All the very best. Thank you. And don't forget to go into your learning platform. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of the week. And we'll catch up in a fortnight. Thank you and goodbye.